May 5, 1864 dawned gray and ominous over the dense Virginia woodland known as the Wilderness, where Lieutenant General Ulysses Simpson Grant would face his first direct confrontation with the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. The morning mist clung to the twisted branches of scrub oak and pine like ghostly fingers, concealing what would become one of the Civil War's most nightmarish battlefields, a place where the very forest itself would become both witness and weapon. Grant's Army of the Potomac, over 100,000 strong, had crossed the Rapidan River the previous day with confidence born of numerical superiority. The Union commander, recently promoted to general-in-chief, carried with him the weight of Northern expectations and President Abraham Lincoln's desperate hope for final victory. His adversary, General Robert Edward Lee, commanded barely 60,000 Confederate troops, but he possessed something more valuable than numbers: intimate knowledge of this God-forsaken terrain. The Wilderness stretched across 70 square miles of second-growth forest, a labyrinth of dense undergrowth, fallen logs, and thorny thickets that had grown wild since the region's iron furnaces had consumed the original timber decades earlier. Visibility rarely extended beyond 50 yards, and in many places a man could barely see his hand before his face. Roads were few and poorly maintained, winding through the green hell like serpents through a maze. Major General George Gordon Meade, commanding the Army of the Potomac under Grant's oversight, had hoped to push through this natural obstacle quickly, emerging onto the open ground beyond where Union artillery and cavalry could prove decisive. But Lee had other plans. The Confederate general understood that in this twisted landscape, superior numbers meant little when soldiers couldn't see their enemies or coordinate their movements effectively. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, the first shots rang out near the Orange Turnpike. Confederate Major General Richard Stoddert Ewell's Second Corps had encountered Union Brigadier General Charles Griffin's division of the Fifth Corps. What began as a skirmish between advance guards quickly escalated as more units were drawn into the fighting like moths to a deadly flame. The sound of battle in the Wilderness was unlike anything soldiers on either side had experienced before. Musket fire echoed strangely through the dense forest, creating confusion about the direction and distance of enemy forces. Orders shouted by officers were swallowed by the vegetation, leaving individual companies and regiments to fight isolated battles against invisible foes. The crack of breaking branches often preceded the whistle of bullets, as soldiers stumbled through the underbrush firing at muzzle flashes and shadows. Private Thomas Galway of the 8th Ohio Infantry later described the experience as fighting in a green tunnel where death could come from any direction. The psychological impact of combat in such terrain was immense. Veteran soldiers who had survived Gettysburg and Antietam found themselves unnerved by an enemy they could hear but rarely see, in a landscape that seemed designed by nature to maximize confusion and terror. As afternoon approached, what had begun as a meeting engagement was transforming into a full-scale battle, with both armies feeding more troops into the meat grinder of the Wilderness. But neither Grant nor Lee could have anticipated the third enemy that would soon join the fight, an enemy that recognized no uniform, respected no flag, and showed mercy to neither blue nor gray. By mid-afternoon on May 5th, the Battle of the Wilderness had evolved into a series of disconnected firefights scattered throughout the dense forest, each regiment and company fighting what felt like its own private war. The dry undergrowth, parched from an unusually rainless spring, crackled underfoot as thousands of soldiers maneuvered through the tangled maze of branches and thorns. Lieutenant Colonel Horace Porter of Grant's staff would later write in his memoirs that the forest seemed to swallow entire brigades whole, as units became separated from their parent commands and wandered through the green labyrinth like lost children. Communication between different parts of the battlefield became nearly impossible, with courier riders frequently unable to find the officers they sought to reach. The first wisps of smoke appeared around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, noticed initially by Sergeant William McCall of the 146th New York Infantry as his regiment engaged Confederate sharpshooters near Saunders Field. What began as thin tendrils rising from the leaf litter soon thickened into ominous gray clouds that drifted between the trees like harbingers of doom. The combination of muzzle flashes, wadding from paper cartridges, and the friction of metal against dry wood had ignited the forest floor in multiple locations simultaneously. The unusually dry conditions, created by weeks without significant rainfall, turned the wilderness into a tinderbox waiting for the spark that warfare inevitably provided. Confederate Brigadier General John Brown Gordon, commanding a division in Ewell's Corps, was among the first officers to recognize the magnitude of the new threat. The very earth seemed to exhale flame, he later recalled, describing how small fires spread with alarming speed through the accumulated debris of fallen leaves, dead branches, and dried undergrowth that carpeted the forest floor. As the fires spread, they created a phenomenon that horrified veterans of both armies: the screams of wounded soldiers who couldn't escape the advancing flames. Men who had been shot and lay helpless among the underbrush faced a death more terrible than any bullet could provide. Both Union and Confederate soldiers began risking their lives to carry wounded comrades away from the spreading fires, often exposing themselves to enemy fire in acts of desperate humanity. The smoke began to change the nature of the battle itself. Visibility, already limited by the dense vegetation, became even more restricted as thick clouds of acrid smoke drifted across the battlefield. Soldiers found themselves firing at shapes that might be enemies, trees, or their own comrades displaced by the confusion. The normal sounds of battle, shouted orders, the rattle of musketry, the crash of artillery, became muffled and distorted by the smoke that seemed to muffle sound as effectively as it blocked vision. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock, commanding the Union Second Corps, later described the afternoon as a descent into hell itself, where his men fought not only against Lee's veterans, but against a foe that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath their feet. The psychological impact of fighting in a burning forest proved nearly as daunting as the physical danger, as soldiers found themselves questioning whether they were advancing toward the enemy or retreating deeper into a fiery maze from which there might be no escape. As evening approached, what had begun as isolated brush fires had merged into larger conflagrations that created their own weather patterns, generating winds that spread the flames even faster through the drought-stricken woodland. The Battle of the Wilderness was becoming something unprecedented in American military history, a battle where fire would claim as many casualties as lead. The night of May 5th brought no respite from either battle or flame as the fires that had begun as scattered brush blazes merged into massive conflagrations that painted the wilderness sky an apocalyptic orange. The forest had become a furnace where two armies found themselves trapped between the horrors of war and the elemental fury of unchecked fire. Captain Robert Stiles of the Richmond Howitzers, positioned near the Orange Plank Road, described the scene in his post-war memoir as Dante's Inferno brought to life in the Virginia woods. The air itself seemed to burn, thick with smoke so dense that breathing became a conscious struggle. Many soldiers tied wet cloths over their faces when water could be found, creating makeshift masks that provided minimal protection against the choking fumes. The fires created a tactical nightmare for commanders on both sides. Traditional military formations became impossible to maintain as units scattered to avoid the advancing flames, while the smoke made artillery targeting guesswork at best. Confederate Colonel Edward Porter Alexander, Lee's chief of artillery, later wrote that his gunners were firing blind into a wall of smoke, guided only by the flashes of enemy muskets that appeared and disappeared like fireflies in the gloom. Throughout the burning forest, acts of remarkable humanity punctuated the horror of combat. Union Private Samuel Crawford of the 76th New York Infantry would later receive the Medal of Honor for repeatedly venturing into burning sections of the forest to rescue wounded Confederate soldiers, demonstrating that in the face of such elemental terror, the bonds of common humanity could transcend the divisions of war. Similarly, Confederate soldiers were observed carrying wounded Union men away from the spreading fires, understanding that some enemies were more terrible than those wearing different colored uniforms. The fires created their own tactical opportunities and disasters. Confederate Brigadier General James Longstreet's 1st Corps, arriving from winter quarters around Gordonsville, found their planned dawn assault complicated by walls of flame that blocked traditional approach routes. Longstreet, Lee's most trusted lieutenant and a man known for his methodical approach to warfare, was forced to improvise attacks through gaps between fire zones, creating a patchwork battle plan that bore little resemblance to conventional military doctrine. Major General Governor Kemble Warren, commanding the Union 5th Corps, faced similar challenges as his divisions became fragmented by the need to avoid burning sections of forest. According to contemporary accounts documented in the official records of the War of the Rebellion, Warren's men were forced to abandon prepared defensive positions multiple times as fires made their positions untenable, creating a fluid battlefield where yesterday's strong points became today's death traps. The night fighting took on an especially surreal quality as muzzle flashes illuminated faces blackened with soot and smoke, while the constant crackle of burning wood provided a hellish soundtrack to the ongoing combat. Soldiers reported that the smell of gunpowder became indistinguishable from the smoke of burning forest, creating a sensory confusion that added to the psychological strain of fighting in such conditions. Perhaps most horrifying were the sounds that pierced through the noise of battle and fire, the screams of wounded men who lay helpless as flames approached their positions. Both armies organized informal truces in local areas to evacuate the wounded, but these merciful interludes were scattered and temporary, unable to address the full scope of the catastrophe unfolding in the burning wilderness. As dawn approached on May 6th, the fires showed no signs of abating, and both Grant and Lee faced the unprecedented challenge of continuing a major battle in a landscape that had become nature's own weapon of mass destruction. May 6th dawned not with the golden light of sunrise, but through a hellish orange glow that filtered through smoke clouds so thick they turned day into a perpetual twilight. The Battle of the Wilderness had entered its 2nd day, and the forest fires that had begun as scattered blazes had transformed into massive conflagrations that created their own weather systems, generating fierce winds that spread the flames with demonic efficiency. General Robert Edward Lee, despite his 67 years, had spent the night moving between command positions, his usually immaculate gray uniform stained with soot and ash. The Confederate commander faced a crisis that no military textbook had prepared him for: how to conduct offensive operations when the very battlefield was consuming itself. His Army of Northern Virginia, though smaller than Grant's force, had initially used the terrain to their advantage, but now that same terrain threatened to become their tomb. Lieutenant General James Longstreet's 1st Corps had finally arrived after their exhausting night march from winter quarters, but their planned flanking attack along the Orange Plank Road had to be completely reimagined. The dense smoke made reconnaissance nearly impossible, while the spreading fires created impassable barriers that forced Confederate units to bunch up along the few clear routes of advance. Longstreet, a methodical general who preferred careful preparation, found himself forced to launch attacks based on guesswork and desperate hope. On the Union side, Lieutenant General Ulysses Simpson Grant maintained his characteristic composure despite facing circumstances that would have unnerved lesser commanders. Seated on a fallen log near his headquarters, calmly whittling a stick while ash fell around him like gray snow, Grant embodied the steady resolve that had made him Lincoln's choice to finally end the war. But even Grant's iron nerves were tested as courier after courier brought reports of units lost in the smoke, of regiments separated from their brigades, and of wounded soldiers abandoned to the flames. The fighting itself had taken on characteristics unlike any previous Civil War battle. Traditional line formations had largely collapsed as soldiers advanced in loose skirmish lines, feeling their way through the smoke-filled forest. The crack of muskets was now accompanied by the constant roar of burning wood and the crash of falling trees weakened by fire. Soldiers reported that they often fired at sounds rather than targets, creating a deadly guessing game where friend and foe became indistinguishable in the choking gloom. Brigadier General Alexander Shaler's brigade of the Union 6th Corps found themselves completely cut off from the rest of their division when fires blocked their line of retreat. Shaler's men, veterans of Chancellorsville and Gettysburg, faced the terrifying prospect of being surrounded not just by Confederate forces, but by walls of flame that made escape impossible. Their eventual breakthrough to safety would come only after desperate fighting through smoke so thick that soldiers held onto each other's equipment to avoid becoming lost in the few yards between their positions and safety. The medical corps of both armies faced unprecedented challenges as traditional field hospitals became untenable due to smoke and approaching flames. Dr. Jonathan Letterman's carefully organized ambulance system, which had worked efficiently at previous battles, broke down completely as evacuation routes became blocked by fire and stretcher bearers found themselves unable to breathe in the smoke-filled forest. Many wounded soldiers were carried to the few clearings available, only to find these supposedly safe areas threatened by new fires that seemed to spring up without warning. Confederate Brigadier General John Brown Gordon, commanding Jubal Early's old division, later wrote that the morning of May 6th presented a vision of warfare that belonged more to ancient mythology than modern military science. His men advanced through what he described as corridors of flame, with enemy positions marked not by flags or earthworks, but by the direction from which musket balls emerged from the wall of smoke that had replaced the Virginia forest. As the morning progressed, it became clear that the fires were not merely a complication to the battle. They had become the battle's defining characteristic. By midday on May 6th, the wilderness had become a crematorium where the living fought desperately to avoid joining the dead who were being consumed by flames that showed no mercy to blue or gray alike. The fires had created their own ecosystem of horror, where superheated air made breathing agony, and the constant shower of burning debris turned every step into a potential encounter with death. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock's 2nd Corps had pushed forward along the Orange Plank Road in what initially appeared to be a successful assault against Confederate positions. Hancock, a veteran of every major Eastern theater battle, had earned the nickname Hancock the Superb for his tactical brilliance, but even his considerable skills were tested by conditions that no military academy had ever contemplated. His men advanced through what survivors later described as breathing fire itself, with many soldiers collapsing not from enemy bullets but from smoke inhalation and heat exhaustion. The Confederate response to Hancock's assault demonstrated the adaptability that had made Lee's army so formidable throughout the war. Unable to coordinate a traditional counterattack due to the smoke and flames, Confederate units fought as independent commands, using their intimate knowledge of local terrain to launch surprise attacks from unexpected directions. Brigadier General William Mahone's Virginia Brigade executed a flanking movement that succeeded precisely because it led through terrain so fire-ravaged that Union commanders had deemed it impassable. The sound of battle had evolved into something entirely new in the American military experience. The traditional crash of musket volleys and the boom of artillery had been replaced by a constant, hellish symphony. The roar of flames consuming dry wood, the crack of burning trees falling across trails and clearings, the screams of wounded men who faced a choice between enemy bullets and approaching fire, and the desperate shouts of soldiers trying to maintain unit cohesion in conditions where visibility extended no more than arm's length. Private Wilbur Fisk of the 2nd Vermont Infantry later wrote to his hometown newspaper that the very air seemed to be our enemy, thick with smoke that burned our lungs and filled our eyes with tears that did nothing to wash away the soot that covered everything. Fisk's regiment had become separated from the rest of their brigade while attempting to flank Confederate positions near Widow Tapp's farm, and spent hours wandering through burning forest before stumbling upon friendly lines purely by accident. The climax of Longstreet's assault came when Confederate forces overran several Union artillery positions, capturing guns whose crews had been forced to abandon their pieces when ammunition chests became too hot to approach safely. However, the success proved temporary, as the same fires that had concealed the Confederate approach now made it impossible to remove the captured weapons or maintain positions in areas where the air itself had become unbreathable. Tragedy struck the Confederate High Command when Lieutenant General Longstreet himself fell victim to the confusion created by the smoke-filled battlefield. In an incident eerily reminiscent of Stonewall Jackson's wounding at Chancellorsville exactly 1 year earlier, Longstreet was shot by his own men when visibility became so poor that Confederate soldiers fired on what they believed to be a Union cavalry patrol. The wounding of Lee's most trusted lieutenant, coming at the moment when Confederate forces had achieved their greatest success of the day, demonstrated how the fires had made the battlefield as dangerous for generals as for common soldiers. The afternoon of May 6th witnessed acts of heroism that transcended the traditional boundaries of warfare as soldiers from both armies found themselves united against an enemy that recognized no flag or uniform. The fires had created conditions where survival often depended more on human compassion than military tactics, leading to scenes of cooperation between enemies that would have seemed impossible under normal battlefield conditions. Sergeant Major William Wells of the 1st Vermont Cavalry earned lasting fame for leading a rescue party that saved 17 wounded soldiers, 9 Union and 8 Confederate, from a spreading grass fire near Saunders Field. Wells and his volunteers worked for over 2 hours in smoke so thick they had to crawl on their bellies to breathe, using wet blankets to beat back flames while carrying wounded men to safety. His actions, witnessed by soldiers from both armies, earned him the Medal of Honor and the lasting gratitude of Confederate families whose sons he had saved. The medical personnel of both armies found their traditional roles completely transformed by the unprecedented conditions. Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, Sr., serving as a contract surgeon with the Army of the Potomac, later wrote that, "We found ourselves fighting not to heal wounds, but to prevent our patients from being consumed alive." Field hospitals that had been established in supposedly safe clearings were repeatedly forced to relocate as shifting winds brought walls of flame toward the wounded who lay helpless on stretchers and makeshift beds of pine boughs. Confederate Chaplain John Granberry of the 3rd Corps Artillery conducted what he later described as the most terrible service of my ministry when he administered last rites to dozens of wounded soldiers who lay in the path of an approaching fire. Unable to move the most seriously wounded, Granberry remained with them as flames approached, praying with men who faced the certainty of being burned alive. His account, preserved in the Confederate Veteran magazine, provides one of the most harrowing descriptions of how the fires affected not just the physical battlefield, but the spiritual welfare of soldiers who had never imagined facing such a death. The chaos created by the fires led to one of the war's most unusual truces, when units from both armies collaborated to create fire breaks around a field hospital that contained wounded from both sides. Confederate Colonel John Hennigan of the 8th South Carolina Infantry and Union Colonel James Rice of the 44th New York Infantry worked together to organize their men in cutting down trees and clearing underbrush to prevent flames from reaching the wounded. This informal cooperation lasted for several hours, with soldiers who had been trying to kill each other working side by side with axes and shovels while their officers negotiated the boundaries of their temporary peace. Private George Washington Whitman of the 51st New York Infantry, brother of poet Walt Whitman, wrote in his diary that the fires had revealed the fundamental humanity that persists even in the midst of this terrible war. Whitman described watching Confederate soldiers risk their lives to pull wounded Union men away from advancing flames, demonstrating that, when faced with such elemental horror, the bonds that unite us as men prove stronger than the causes that divide us as soldiers. The evening of May 6th brought a phenomenon that veterans of both armies would remember for the rest of their lives: the sound of hundreds of wounded men crying for help from areas that had become too dangerous for rescue parties to reach. These cries, audible above the roar of flames and the crash of falling trees, created a psychological trauma that many survivors found more difficult to bear than memories of conventional combat. Colonel Joshua Chamberlain of the 20th Maine Infantry later wrote that, "No sound of battle ever haunted me as did the voices of those we could not save from the fires that night." As darkness fell on the second day of battle, both armies faced the reality that they were fighting a war unlike any in human history, where the battlefield itself had become as deadly an enemy as the forces arrayed against them. The night of May 6th brought no darkness to the wilderness. Only the hellish glow of a forest transformed into a vast funeral pyre that illuminated the horrors of warfare in ways that no moon or stars ever could. The fires had merged into massive conflagrations that created their own weather systems, generating winds that carried burning debris across miles of battlefield and ignited new blazes wherever the deadly rain fell. General Robert Edward Lee faced the most difficult decision of his military career as reports reached him that entire sections of his army had become isolated by walls of flame. The Confederate commander, whose tactical genius had frustrated Union armies for 3 years, found himself confronting an enemy that could not be outmaneuvered, outfought, or defeated through conventional military means. His staff officers, their uniforms singed and faces blackened with soot, brought increasingly desperate reports of units cut off from supply lines, wounded soldiers abandoned to the flames, and regiments forced to retreat not from enemy pressure, but from the advancing fires that made their positions untenable. Lieutenant General Ulysses Simpson Grant maintained his headquarters near the Germania Plank Road, where he continued to receive reports and issue orders despite conditions that had reduced military communication to little more than informed guesswork. Grant's aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Colonel Horace Porter, later described the scene as commanding an army while seated at the gates of hell itself. The Union general's famous calm remained unshaken, but even Grant's iron composure was tested by the realization that traditional military principles had become meaningless in a battle where the terrain itself had declared war on both armies. The fires had created tactical situations that no military manual had ever addressed. Confederate Brigadier General John Brown Gordon found his division split into isolated fragments by a line of flame that ran directly through his position, making it impossible to coordinate attacks or even maintain communication between different parts of his command. Gordon's men fought as independent companies, each group making tactical decisions based on local conditions that changed from minute to minute as the fires shifted direction with the wind. Union Major General Governor Kemble Warren's 5th Corps faced similar fragmentation as companies and regiments became separated from their parent units, while seeking routes through the burning forest that would allow them to maintain contact with the enemy. Warren, a methodical engineer who had gained fame for his reconnaissance work at Gettysburg, found his careful tactical planning useless in conditions where the battlefield changed faster than maps could be updated and where traditional concepts of flanks and rear areas had become meaningless. The psychological impact of fighting in such conditions proved as devastating as the physical dangers. Soldiers who had survived Antietam, Chancellorsville, and Gettysburg found themselves unnerved by an enemy that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Private Thomas Galway of the 8th Ohio Infantry wrote in his memoir that facing Confederate bullets required courage, but advancing through burning forest while listening to the screams of wounded men we could not save required a kind of fortitude that no training had prepared us for. The flames created opportunities for desperate gambles that would have been impossible under normal battlefield conditions. Confederate Colonel John Hennigan led his 8th South Carolina Infantry through what appeared to be an impassable wall of fire to attack the flank of Hancock's corps, achieving tactical surprise precisely because Union commanders had assumed no attack could come from that direction. Hennigan's men emerged from the flames like demons from hell itself, their clothing smoking and their faces blackened beyond recognition, to strike surprised Union positions before disappearing back into the fiery maze that had become the Wilderness. As the third day of battle dawned, both armies faced the terrible realization that they were fighting not just each other, but the very landscape of Virginia, transformed by war into an environment more hostile than any desert or Arctic waste. The Battle of the Wilderness had become something unprecedented in military history, a conflict where victory or defeat might be determined not by tactical skill or strategic brilliance, but by which army could best adapt to fighting in hell itself. May 7th dawned gray and smoky over a wilderness that had been transformed from a dense Virginia forest into a blackened wasteland dotted with smoldering stumps and carpeted with ash that mixed the remains of trees and men into an indistinguishable gray powder. The Battle of the Wilderness was ending not with the decisive victory that either side had hoped for, but with a stalemate born of conditions that had made conventional warfare impossible. Lieutenant General Ulysses Simpson Grant faced his first direct test against Robert Edward Lee with results that defied easy categorization. The Union Army had suffered approximately 17,000 casualties, while Confederate losses totaled around 11,000. Numbers that in previous campaigns might have been considered a Confederate victory. But Grant understood that this battle had been won and lost by forces beyond human control. And more importantly, he recognized that Lee's army had been unable to destroy the Army of the Potomac despite fighting on ground of their own choosing. The aftermath of the battle revealed the true scope of the catastrophe that had engulfed both armies. Search parties working through the still smoldering forest discovered scenes that haunted survivors for decades. Entire companies of soldiers found burned to death in defensive positions they had been unable to abandon. Artillery pieces with their bronze barrels warped by heat that had reached temperatures sufficient to melt metal, and areas where the fires had burned so intensely that human remains had been reduced to ash, indistinguishable from the forest that had consumed them. Dr. Jonathan Letterman, the Union Army's chief medical officer, later estimated that at least 2,000 soldiers from both armies had died not from enemy action, but from the fires that had turned the battlefield into a crematorium. These casualties represented a new category in military medicine. Soldiers killed by the environment itself, victims of warfare's unintended consequences rather than its deliberate violence. The medical corps of both armies would carry the psychological scars of listening to wounded men burned to death in areas too dangerous for rescue attempts. General Robert Edward Lee, despite his army's survival and Grant's heavy casualties, understood that the Battle of the Wilderness marked a fundamental change in the nature of the war. The Confederate commander had been unable to achieve the decisive victory that might have forced Grant to retreat across the Rapidan River, and Lee recognized that his opponent possessed a determination that differed fundamentally from previous Union commanders. More ominously, Lee understood that Grant's willingness to continue the campaign despite heavy losses represented a strategic approach that the Confederacy might not be able to survive. The fires had created heroes whose actions transcended the political divisions that had brought the armies to Virginia. Congressional Medal of Honor recipient Sergeant William McCall of the 146th New York Infantry had saved the lives of 23 soldiers, both Union and Confederate, by leading them through a gap in the fire lines that he had discovered during reconnaissance patrol. His citation, signed by President Lincoln himself, recognized not just military valor, but the fundamental humanity that persisted even in conditions that seemed designed to strip away all traces of civilization. Confederate Captain Robert Stiles of the Richmond Howitzers wrote in his post-war memoir that the Battle of the Wilderness had demonstrated the limits of human warfare when nature itself becomes a participant in the conflict. Stiles observed that the fires had created a kind of democracy of suffering where generals and privates, Union and Confederate soldiers, faced identical threats that recognized no military rank or political allegiance. The strategic consequences of the battle became clear when Grant ordered the Army of the Potomac to continue its advance toward Richmond rather than retreating to lick its wounds, as previous commanders had done. This decision, made while the wilderness still smoldered around both armies, signaled a new phase of the Civil War where battles would be measured not by tactical victories but by strategic persistence. The Army of Northern Virginia had survived the wilderness, but Lee understood that survival was no longer sufficient when facing an opponent with Grant's resources and determination. As both armies moved south toward their next confrontation at Spotsylvania Courthouse, they left behind a battlefield unlike any in American military history, a forest transformed into a memorial where the ashes of trees and soldiers mingled in testimony to warfare's capacity for horror that exceeded human imagination. The Battle of the Wilderness had ended, but its legacy would burn in the memories of survivors long after the last embers had cooled in the Virginia soil. The wilderness would remain a haunted place for decades after the war, avoided by local residents who reported that on still nights they could hear the echoes of men crying for help from a forest that no longer existed, victims of the day when fire itself had joined the ranks of America's Civil War.